I'm Mark Golub, joined by Shahar Azani, as we bring you an Israeli election update. As I'm sure many of you remember, there was no clear-cut winner in the March 3rd elections. Likud wound up with 36 seats, but a natural coalition on the right would only bring a Netanyahu-led coalition to 58 seats, 3 shy of the necessary majority of 61. On the left, Blue and White wound up with 33 seats, and their coalition partners added another 14. But this only totals 47 seats, far short of the magic number of 61. The joint Arab list won the other 15 seats, and from here it gets very interesting. So I wanted to give you a chance just to talk with me and with the JBS audience as to what things happen now. You know, we looked at the first election, no coalition. Second election, no coalition. Then we met election night, and you talked about a couple of scenarios. And lo and behold, you seem to be to be prescient on what might happen. Because what you said, and I was skeptical, was that Blue and White might try to form what you call a minority government.
Yes.
I want you to explain, what's happened. What do you think might happen now? And it is fascinating for you, isn't it?
It's absolutely fascinating and very crucial for Israel at this point, because nobody seems to want to go to a fourth round of elections.
Yes.
But we dare utter the words. Who could have believed that a year ago we'll even utter the words fourth round?
Okay, so I want to know, what are the possibilities for either Netanyahu and a right-wing-led coalition, or Benny Gantz and a left-wing coalition, to take the numbers as we have them now and arrive at 61 somehow?
Right.
Give us the scenarios.
The scenario. So first of all, the one option would be let's call it a factional government, one that's either established on the right or the left. When you look into Likud and Benjamin Netanyahu, who's had an astounding achievement with 36 seats for himself, for running 4 to 5 events a day, somebody who relishes politics, and his bloc, which, by the way, he very wisely has been keeping united at all times, has 58 votes. 58 is not enough.
Yes.
For him to be able to establish a right-wing government, he needs at least 3 more members of Knesset to quote-unquote defect from the other bloc.
And you remember when we met right after the election that same night, you, Steve Boehm, there was discussion, and even with Susie Rosenbluth, that it might be that you named people who might defect, but at that point, he seemed to have 59 and only needed 2.
59-60 even. They were talking about 59-60, so the name that was mentioned was Orly Levy of Gesher.
Yes.
But before we dive into it, because she plays a significant role,
we're
looking at the narrow right-wing government does not seem plausible with 58. So we're moving to the main move that has been rocking Israeli politics.
Okay, but I want to make sure people hear you. A right-wing, Likud-led coalition is now less likely.
Correct.
Okay, keep
It's now
going.
less likely.
Less likely.
But what happened right after the elections? Blue and White emerged with a move that stunned the Israeli politics. They have decided, you remember when we discussed, Mark, we said there are 2 options. Which is greater? The quote-unquote hatred of Benjamin Netanyahu and the desire to end his rule, or whatever relationship are there between Avigdor Lieberman and Israel Beitenu on the one hand, and the joint Arab list that emerged also victorious from this round of elections with 15 members of Knesset, compared to 10 in April of last year, 13 of September of 2019, 15 this time. And indeed, their first move was to try and create a government that is going to be comprised of Blue and White and then the left-wing Labor, with the support from the outside of the coalition of the Arab parties, the Arab Joint List. Now, why was that so unrattling? Because Blue and White made it very clear, continuously, in dozens of interviews to Israeli media and in promises to the Israeli public, that they are not going to be dependent in any way, shape, or form on the Joint Arab List to create a government. And even when interviewers like you pushed them and said, do you think, are you sure? We're looking at the numbers. It doesn't make sense. They insisted, including Bogi Ya'alon and others, read our lips. How can we, they said, chiefs of staff, will be dependent on the Joint Arab List, the party that wants to indict us in The Hague for war crimes, some of its members at least. So the Israeli public was very surprised to see that the first move they were making as Blue and White was to try to create that kind of minority government. Why minority? Because the support of the Arabs was supposed to be from the outside.
What does that, explain to our audience, what does it mean, support
from the outside? It means that the Joint Arab List would not become officially part of the government.
It would not.
No, not ministers, but they would raise a hand in the Knesset in support of its establishment. So that means that ministers in the government, you'd probably have Labor, Gesher, Meretz, plus Blue and White. And from the outside, you would have Lieberman and the Arabs supporting the establishment of that government. What would that do? That would immediately depose Netanyahu from his current position as the prime minister of a transitional government, as Israel has been in transition for over a year, and you would have Benny Gantz as prime minister. But here you could see the political shrewdness. Compared to Netanyahu, who's been working on his bloc, who's been working with his bloc, who knows it inside and out. You have Blue and White that apparently failed to do the basic math of wait, who is actually going to support us in this? And two members of Knesset from within Blue and White were very outspoken against the establishment of such a government. Yoaz Hendel, and Tzvika Hauser. Tzvika Hauser used to be the government secretary under Benjamin Netanyahu. Yoaz Hendel was also part of the prime minister's office, dealing with what we call public diplomacy. And both of them members of Knesset under the faction of Bogi Ya'alon within Blue and White. Blue and White is comprised of three factions, of Benny Gantz's faction, Bogi Ya'alon's faction, and Yair Lapid's faction.
Last time around, by the way, Bogi Ya'alon was not part of it the way that Lapid was a part of it.
No, they were all together. All of them started.
Although at one point, Gantz and Lapid were going to share the role of prime minister.
So the discussion at the beginning was because Yair Lapid and Yesh Atid came with a strong faction that's had parliamentary experience, whereas Bogi's faction and Benny Gantz's were utterly new. The idea was to create some sort of a rotation between Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz. Later on, it was retracted when they felt it wouldn't be beneficial. But again, these two members from the Bogi Ya'alon faction announced publicly on social media and beyond, we will not support. This is a time of emergency for Israel. We believe in national unity, and this is what we should strive for. Boom, Mark.
So they refused to
support, publicly refused to support any notion of a minority government supported by the Arabs from the outside. And when they were reprimanded, and some would say harshly reprimanded, by Bogi Ya'alon, they were very insistent, we have no intention of allowing this. You're already talking in this scenario of, listen to this, assuming the issue comes for a vote, 60, because Bibi's bloc is now augmented by these two, as opposed to the 60 on Benny Gantz's side. You already have an impasse that does not allow Benny Gantz to move forward with establishing his minority government. And that's without counting other members of Knesset from within Benny Gantz's bloc who have their own qualms about this possibility, who feel that it's not appropriate because they made a promise to the Israeli electorate.
And the promise was?
Not to be dependent on the votes of the Joint Arab List to create a government. There are some who voted for Blue and White from within the Israeli religious sector. These people, it's reasonable to assume, would have never voted for Benny Gantz had they known. Now let's take a moment, Mark, just to understand what is the Joint Arab List. You're talking about 15 members of Knesset, but they're diverse from within. and their support is not automatic. Even within that scenario of a minority government, there are three outstanding members within that group. First of all, I'll remind you that Ayman Odeh, who is the head of the party, represents Hadash, which is the Democracy and Equality Arab Party. It's a communist party, and that's the head. Communism today in Israel. Communism, socialism, democratic socialism, not sure. But then you move to the Balad party. Balad is very important because Balad's position has been very much to the extreme. What do I mean when I say to the extreme? There is a lot of talk within the American Jewish public about the BDS movement. And one of the greatest disqualifiers of the BDS movement is their support for the right of return. The right of return is the negation of Israel as a Jewish state.
Palestinian return.
Palestinian return, indeed. The right of return. And indeed, in this case, Balad, in one of its main agenda items and platforms, is the support for the right of return, the negation of the Jewish character of the State of Israel, the denial of official status of the Jewish agency and other national institutions. So this is problematic, and it brought the party many a time to be confronted with attempts to disqualify it from actually running in the Knesset. Even in this round of elections, one of these Knesset members, a young woman by the name of Hiba Yazbek. Anybody who is into the political quagmire in Israel knows that name. Why? Because she was up for disqualification by the Central Election Committee only a few weeks ago. On what basis? She praised two people. One on social media. One was Samir Kuntar. Samir Kuntar is a Druze Lebanese terrorist whom in 1979 killed a young Israeli family in Nahariya. He murdered a 31-year-old father, and he killed a 4-year-old daughter on the beach in a cruelest of manners, which I don't feel the need to describe today. She praised him as a shaheed, as a hero. In addition, she mentioned another female terrorist, Dalal Mughrabi, who participated in 1978 in a great massacre of Israelis on a bus. 35 people dead, 71 wounded, including 12 children who were executed by these terrorists. Dalal Mughrabi was a 20-year-old terrorist who was leading that group. She posted on her social media feed, look at how much Dalal achieved in her short life. To that, we truly feel detest towards such state. And yet, she was proposed for disqualification. And indeed, even Blue and White, by the way, voted in favor of disqualifying her. Therefore, the Central Election Committee, in preparation for this round of election, decided she's not eligible to run. The Israeli Supreme Court reversed that decision and said that her statements, as she clarified them, were not made in support of terror, but rather in opposition to the occupation, and therefore she was allowed to run. So these three members of Balad, including Hiba Yazbek, are not supposed to or are not expected to support Benny Gantz, which means that Benny Gantz's majority is reduced by an additional 3, who at best may abstain. So you're talking about 12 out of the 15 who may even play that game. So he's working on a very narrow majority.
Does it mean that he was unrealistic to think he could do it at all?
Anybody who looks at it from the outside sees negligence.
Okay.
You have not even gone into the numbers. Now, what happened? You decided to breach...
I want to make sure, again,
Yes.
the audience understands, because you're making an interesting point here. What you're saying is that there was a degree of irresponsibility
Yes.
in leadership by Benny Gantz for not having prepared
Correct.
or thinking it through well enough, correct?
That's what it looks like. And when you go to such a move, it comes at a price. Because
What's the price?
You decided to breach your promise to the Israeli electorate.
Not to
Breach it.
involve the Arabs.
Not to be dependent on their votes to create a government. That is a clear promise you made.
Yes.
Maybe you shouldn't have.
Right.
Maybe you should have sat there and said, we will do whatever it takes to be done with Netanyahu, including getting and that's a legitimate position. But you didn't take that position. You spoke about Jewish majority, you spoke about Zionist majority, you didn't say that. And yet you decide to break your promise to the Israeli electorate. Now, breaking the promise and then failing in executing it, you lose on both ends, because you weren't even able to deliver that minority-supported government. Now, assuming you go for a 4th round of elections, That will be a catastrophe for blue and white, because the Israeli public had on full display what blue and white intended to do. And they had a choice. They had a choice between breaking one promise or breaking another. One promise was, we will never sit under an indicted Prime Minister Netanyahu. Second promise was, we will never be supported by the Arabs from the outside. They had to choose which one to break. Clearly, the current impasse leads us to such a direction where somebody is going to have to break their promise. Which one should they have broken? My political instinct is clear. They should have come out and said, due to the coronavirus crisis and due to the impending security challenges and in a desire to prevent a fourth round, we will accept the president's solution that was offered after the second round of elections, and we will go for an emergency national unity government. And if that means that they will have to sit under Netanyahu for a few months, so be it.
But they couldn't do that.
And so far they can. Now, it remains to be seen what will happen, because it's clear that their failure to proceed with a minority government will be catastrophic for them in the polls, not only because of the breach of promise, but because of lack of leadership and ability to execute. The Israelis expect their leaders to be shrewd enough to function on world stage. Clearly, Netanyahu has shown his ability to play wisely on that platform. So even those who object to his style of leadership understand that there has to be an element of trust of the ordinary Israeli vis-a-vis the leadership. And to that, I'll just add this. If you didn't have enough, we have one more person. You remember we spoke about Orly Levy. Orly Levy, the daughter of famed Israeli politician David Levy, who was Netanyahu's rival in the 90s, one of the pillars of Likud, and she joined with Labor and Gesher and Meretz. To begin with, her constituents are not those of Meretz. She does not represent necessarily that segment in the population, but she joined forces with them. And lo and behold, while you have this struggle of a minority-supported government by the joint Arab list, nobody knows, we know where the two defectors supposedly of blue and white stand. She comes out and says, I have no intention of supporting such a government. And blue and white coalition lose yet another important member. Now remember, it's a very close game. So every vote counts and every member of Knesset counts. And she comes out and says, to begin with, the bloc with Meretz, with a left-leaning party, was a technical one to begin with. It was never an identity of interest, and I, for one, will not support a government that is dependent on the Arab vote. And that took the discussion to an extreme where the many members on the left were puffing and heaving and so upset as a result of her move. But like we spoke, we saw her as a Likudish element. Why? Because where did she come from? Orly Levy initially was part of Jeopardy, $250,000 question, part of Israel Beitenu, Avigdor Lieberman's party. So her move was aimed at two people. And I'm sorry I'm going down to the Talmud here, but it's important to note. Orly Levy was part of Avigdor Lieberman's party. She left because she couldn't execute her policies from within that party. So she had a bone to pick with Lieberman. In the first round of elections, where she ran on her own, there were discussions between her and Benny Gantz. One of the ideas was for her to run along with blue and white. And it seemed natural for them to have another woman leader, social leader, somebody who is a Sephardic, who comes from those realms. It didn't happen. She ran alone. She didn't pass the electoral threshold. So Orly Levy, and all I'm saying, I'm depicting a reality. Orly Levy waits on the sidelines, allows blue and white to proceed with a futile move, makes sure that Avigdor Lieberman takes a picture with them as they concoct together this minority-supported government, and then lays the bomb. In a move that was interpreted by many as aiming towards these two, Benny Gantz, who refused to include her on his list, and Avigdor Lieberman, from whose party she was ejected.
Interesting. Fascinating. Talk for a moment about Lieberman, because one of the issues was, to what extent, and you began this way, to what extent would he be willing to sit in any way with a government supported by Arabs? To what extent was he just determined to sink Netanyahu? And where does he come out?
Right. So even though at the beginning, last year, one would think that Lieberman would be a natural element of the bloc and of the right-wing party, and even though many of Lieberman's voters are perceived to be such that would support Netanyahu as prime minister, something came out a few days ago in the Israeli media that may or may not have a connection. Lieberman was documented as saying that he's very upset with Netanyahu because he believes that Netanyahu stands behind accusations leveled at Lieberman's children in the police that at the end were meant to start a criminal investigation into some of their dealings.
Lieberman's children.
Lieberman's children. So he was very upset with it. It
never ends.
And then he starts with, where is his biggest engine? His detest of the Arabs or his desire to bring down Netanyahu? And he made a promise. He said, I'm going to make a decision, he said. I will not allow for a fourth round. And it seemed like he was about to make that decision with his outside support, along with the Arabs, of a minority government to depose Netanyahu. And right then, as they thought they had it in their hands, poof.
Okay. But it sounds to me, as you describe it sophisticatedly, that they'd never had 15 Arabs.
Correct. At best, it seems that they would have 12 who may support plus 3 abstain. Maybe that would have changed. Maybe due to the need, they would convince Balad. But can you imagine what it means when Benny Gantz and Blue and White require the support of a party so extreme that demands the right of return for Palestinians and negates Israel's Jewish nature in order for them to govern? And not to mention what everybody would be thinking at that point is what kind of payment was given in exchange for that support?
Yes. What about Netanyahu's fortunes in and of themselves, and that on March 17th, his trial is going to begin? How does that play into the evolution of the creation of a government?
That's an excellent question, Mark. So let's shine a light onto that dark corner for a minute and sift through the cobwebs. Why is it so reasonable, or in my opinion, why would it be reasonable for Benny Gantz to move in the direction of a national unity government? Instead of breaking the promise vis-a-vis the joint Arab list, he could have broken the promise and sat with Netanyahu for a very simple reason. There is no need to wage a war against Netanyahu. Netanyahu, in many ways, has a time bomb strapped to his leg. The criminal proceedings in court starting March 17th, and even to a greater extent, by the way, Netanyahu asked the court for a postponement, did not get it. So March 17th, he starts his trial. That's one heavy weight, one heavy load that he has to carry. A second one is the legal question. It's the first time ever in Israel that you have a prime minister who was officially indicted in court and who has that indictment pending and who has to come to court to defend himself while being in office. The law, some say that the law does not pertain to that situation. So is this allowed? Is this okay? Even though I would argue differently, the Israeli law stipulates that the prime minister needs to, will have to defend himself, etc., which means that the law does pertain to this and decided to allow the prime minister, such a prime minister, to move forward. But there is a pending petition before the Israeli Supreme Court. In January, the Israeli Supreme Court was requested by 70 public figures in Israel to make a decision on this issue. May the president of Israel give the task of establishing a coalition government to a person, a member of Knesset, who was indicted. The Supreme Court looked into the matter and said, you know what? We're not going to make a decision, not because we can't. It is a justiciable question, but because at this point in time, it's only theoretical. The Attorney General, Avichai Mendelblit, who presides over Netanyahu's indictments, was also requested for his opinion on the matter, which he refused to give. Now we seem to be at the point where they have to make a decision. Quickly enough, right after the election, the last round, those same petitioners submitted their claim against to the court. And the court will have to make some sort of a decision.
Do you have an instinct which way it'll go?
It's very tough. Why is it tough? Netanyahu worked very hard for these elections. Why did he work hard? Because he knew He needed the power of the people. He needed to be able to stand before the judicial authorities and to say that 1,352,000 people who voted Likud knew about the indictment, knew what he was facing, and yet they chose to give him the keys to manage the country. And he will ask the court a simple question: do you come instead of the sovereignty of the people? Do you put yourself where millions of citizens, and I'm not even mentioning the bloc, because anybody else who voted for Naftali Bennett's party, who voted for United Torah Judaism, who voted for Shas, the Sephardic Haredi Association, all of these people knew that this is part of Netanyahu's bloc. So voting Shas, and Shas said it as much, voting Shas means voting Netanyahu. So the support for Netanyahu was over 2 million people who said, we want him to be our premier. What will the court do? And it really touches the core of the sensitive issue of the checks and balances in Israeli society. What should be the power of the Supreme Court vis-a-vis the power of the Knesset? Now, had it not been the case, let's say Bibi failed miserably or got a meager result in his view of 29 seats, maybe at such point the court would be emboldened to say, I'm sorry, we cannot allow for such a situation to happen. Now, if I want to take just 1 minute, I want to go back to the Rabin government. The Rabin government during the Oslo times had Shas as part of that government. Now, that gave the Rabin government the majority. Think about, we spoke about this, about how much the center and left shrunk, where labor and Meretz alone could comprise a government in 1992-3, but now together they're barely 6-7 members of Knesset. And yet you have the Rabin government and you have Shas. And Shas at the time had Aryeh Deri, same Aryeh Deri, just a lot of experience in between and some prison time. And Aryeh Deri is indicted. And the Prime Minister, Rabin at the time, the late Prime Minister Rabin, signs a letter with Shas saying, I want you to be part of my government. I have no intention of firing you. He wanted Shas. He needed Shas. And yet when Aryeh Deri was indicted, the issue came before the Supreme Court. And Rabin expressed his position through the Attorney General that says, A, I'm not obliged by Israeli law to fire the minister. He can manage his affairs because he's still presumed innocent. And B, I gave him a letter of commitment. I committed to him that I'm not going to fire him. And the Supreme Court said, what would a reasonable prime minister do? And a reasonable prime minister needs to fire Aryeh Deri because it doesn't make sense for an indicted minister so. And that's what happened when the Supreme Court enacted this rule that does not allow a minister or deputy minister to preside with indictments. Then why a prime minister? Why is it so difficult? Seems to be, if you were doing Talmud, pshita. If I have a deputy minister or minister who cannot preside, then of course a prime minister should not preside with indictments. But the truth is different, because a prime minister's removal means an upheaval of the coalition, whereas a minister's removal has limited effect. This is an important factor that is going to be played out in the coming weeks.
Okay, we only have a minute left.
Can't believe it. No, can't be.
It sounds to me, like, as complicated as it is, at the moment, setting aside the indictment and the trial of March 17th, it is more likely today that Netanyahu will be able to cobble together 61 than Gantz will.
Very tough, because for Netanyahu to be able to bring 61 to support
Well, you
his
mentioned
government.
3 people who would
Yeah,
come
but
over.
the 2 members of Blue and White will not support a minority government, but it doesn't mean they'll support a Netanyahu government.
So we're headed for 4th term?
So
fourth
my
round?
hope, my hope, national unity government based on the corona crisis and emergency.
And who will push that? 30 seconds. Who will push unity government? Will Rivlin have
The hope is for Rivlin to do it, for Netanyahu to agree, and for Gantz to acquiesce.
We will continue to look at this together.
I'm looking forward.
Fabulous. Fabulous to have Shahar with us. And that's his analysis as we continue to keep you informed of Israeli election 2020. And we'll be here all the time as events move on. JBS will bring them to you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends, and Am Yisrael Chai.